As Jesus made his way into the holy city of Jerusalem, the crowds cheered their Messiah. They thought at that time that he would replace the Romans and bring about a new order, a new glory to Israel. But their understanding of the Messiah as a powerful warrior was not going to be. At least that's not what they got in Jesus. By the end of that week, Jesus is crucified, abandoned, despised on a tree. And the early Christians had to struggle with that their Messiah was one who suffered and died. Trying to make sense of that, they turned to the words of 2nd Isaiah, where they found the suffering servant. This is to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick until he brings justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope. Certainly, what Jesus endures can be understood through the words of the prophet Isaiah. But I want to ask, when those words were originally spoken, were they in fact an advance prophecy? Or is the servant someone else? If for a moment we just set aside our messianic prophecy, understanding suffering servant as Jesus, for a moment, we want to look at the text itself and its context. When we do so, we discover in Isaiah 41, verses 8 to 9, within the text itself, "But you, O Israel, my servant Jacob, whom I called." The passage itself seems to be referring to Israel, the people. Could the people themselves be the suffering servant? Well, if you think of it, the whole experience of exile was a tremendous amount of suffering. And the call of the prophet to justice, to be a light to the nations, things that this servant embraces, are in fact the ancient call of the prophets to Israel, to be a light to the nations, to show forth God's justice to the ends of the earth. And through Israel, and through seeing and incorporating God's justice into their lives, the nations themselves are led to connection with God or salvation. Another possibility is some anonymous prophet. That the suffering servant, in the context of the exile, can be the one who embodies the whole struggle of the nation. And what we're talking about here is a prophet whose life itself and his own sufferings illustrate what the people went through in exile. Let's also add to our list Jesus, the early Christians. So what's the right answer? Is the suffering servant Israel? Well, yes. Is it some sort of an anonymous prophet that embodies the struggle that Israel went through in the exile? Well, sure, it could be that. It could also be, as those early Christians understood it, the life of Jesus. What is common to each of these? First, that the suffering of a nation, of an individual, of the one who we call the Son of God, is able to shape and to be a path towards reconciliation and restoration. The path of the suffering servant, the servant of God, is one that is willing to walk through trials and tribulations, not for themselves, but for the people. There is a self-giving and emptying, a kenosis that happens here. And that is restorative. That helps to bring about something new. The second is that God is very much connected with this servant. The servant is sustained and strengthened, and even when it seems like God has abandoned, God goes with the servant into the very places of suffering. And that presence of God, that's what helps. That's what helps to bring about a transformation. Finally, justice, being a light, a witness to others. All three embody this sort of higher purpose. The mission of the servant is clear: to redeem the people, to reconnect the people with their God, and to give a witness, a larger witness to all the peoples of the world. This is how life is in God's name, and when it's lived in that way, that it brings new life and hope to the entire planet. As we find ourselves struggling and in times of trouble, the suffering servant reminds us that God is near. Instead of looking at the moments of glory and triumph, we're invited to look for God in the hurt of not only our own lives, but of the world. The cross stands as a reminder for Christians that God is present in the midst of our tragedy, in the midst of our hurt, in the lives of the oppressed people of the world, in situations that no one else wants to be in, and that God, because God is present in those places, there is restoration. For with God there comes resurrected.